shortly. We've Nicholas back there, who is the CEO and founder of Echidna Energy. Nicholas will tell you more about himself and what Echidna does. Basically a community-based not-for-profit that's built to try to give the community autonomy and control over the generation and the use of their own energy. We have Professor Glenn Pratt, who is not here personally, but he's online. I think Glenn's online, and I think he can kind of hear us. So Glenn is a professor of practice at the University of Sydney and is one of Australia's leading experts in renewable energy and battery technology. He was with the CSIRO. He's helped most of the Australian government authorities sort of develop and think about their renewable energy plans. So he's the resident technical and industry expert, and he'll join us live for the Q&A. He'll be able to answer all the questions that Nicholas and I can't answer. And we also, objectives today, we want to hear from you as well. We want to put some ideas out there for you, but we want to get your feedback about what you think is important, what you think will work, what you think the drivers of community engagement around community batteries and renewable energy is going to be. So my job is to set the scene a little bit for what Nicholas and Glenn are going to talk about a bit later. There are two pieces of context that I wanted to give everyone to set the scene for this. The first is rising energy prices, and this is happening in the context of a major inflation and cost of living challenge that households and people and residents and businesses are facing in Australia at the moment. I mean, this is probably the national political issue at the moment. Cost of living pressures for households, people not being able to afford housing or their rents, and energy prices, power prices, gas prices continuing to go up. So on the 1st of July, literally in about a week's time, there's going to be about, for a lot of New South Wales residents, an over 20% increase again on power bills. And already in this economic context where people are already struggling to put food on the table, struggling with the cost of living, another 20% increase in power prices is just going to make things that much more difficult. The second piece of context I wanted to set the scene with is our discussion today around community batteries is just a piece of a much bigger picture around what our country needs to do to transition from a fossil fuel sort of driven energy system to one that is much more low carbon, much more driven by renewables. And this chart here is from the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, and it comes from what they call their integrated system plan. And this lays out what they believe to be the most likely scenario about how Australia gets to net zero in 2050. So we've got a target, we've got to hit net zero in 2050. We're at kind of 2023, 2024 now, so we've got about 25 years. And this is kind of what needs to happen to our energy system and our energy market in order for us to get to 2050. And this scenario here is what they call the step change scenario. It is not the most ambitious scenario. The most ambitious scenario that is contained in this report is what they call the hydrogen superpower one, where Australia becomes a hydrogen superpower. And if that happens, this is next level again. But this is what AEMO believe to be the most plausible scenario for how the energy transition will happen in Australia. Now, I just wanted to provide this context to say that there is an enormous amount of investment that is required in order to get us from here, where we are now, up to there. Sorry, all the numbers have gone. Essentially, that is where we are now. That is 2023, 2022, 2023, and this is 2050. And they're all the years that go up. And in a nutshell, what we're going to have to do as a country is we need to treble the overall capacity of the national energy market. So here you can see this is the current capacity now, it's about 85 gigawatts here, and we need to grow that up to about 270 gigawatts. So the overall capacity of the energy system needs to treble, number one. Number two, we will need a 9 times increase in utility scale variable renewable energy capacity. Variable renewable energy just means solar, big utility scale solar farms, wind farms, hydro, other renewable sources. We need 9 times that amount compared to what we have now in order to get to, according to this scenario, to net zero by 2050. That is a massive investment across Australia. And that is what different state governments and the federal government is focused on with the renewable energy zones, et cetera, et cetera. But that gives a picture of what's required to build that capacity. Number 3, we need a 5 times increase, about a 5 times increase in distributed PV, meaning essentially that's rooftop solar, right? So already Australia has been leading the world in the uptake of rooftop solar, with not a lot of government support, I've got to say, but Aussies have really taken it up. We need essentially 5 times more within the next 25-year period. So you can see this is distributed PV here. We need to go from that to that over this period. Next, we need 3 times the firming capacity. So my dad's in the audience. He's an electrical engineer, and when I was talking to Dad, a decade ago about renewable energy, Dad would always say, there's a big difference between when you have the big coal-powered fire stations, they provide that big base load energy, where if there are fluctuations and surges in the energy grid, it can absorb those spikes and not have everything short circuit. The problem is when you move to renewable energy, you don't have that big sort of firming base load sort of power. And so one of the big challenges is how do we build in this firming capacity into the grid? And that is done through a combination of utility scale batteries, hydro storage, sort of gas-fired generation, and what they call here behind the meter virtual power plants. Right? So that is really in order to stabilize the grid, to prepare it for almost 100% renewable energy in the future. So that is the sort of technical transformation that the grid needs to go through in order to deal with that level of renewables. In addition to the technical stuff, there is a lot that needs to happen in terms of the software, in terms of the market mechanisms, to deal with the two-way flow of energy. So right now, when you think in the past, if you've got a big coal-fired power plant, it only goes one way, right? So the power plant produces the power and people use the power, so the energy flows one way. As you would know, when you have solar on your roof, the energy goes 2 ways, because if you have excess solar power, you feed it back into the grid through the feed and you get a feed-in tariff for that. The grid now is not designed to have a massive amount of two-way energy flow, and our market mechanisms are not designed for that either. So there needs to be a lot of intellectual energy, a lot of technical energy, market development, in order to be able to handle what they call 100% instantaneous penetration of renewables in the future. And to top it all off, we need to build 10,000 kilometres of new transmission in order to get the different renewables, in order to bring that and to connect up people who need those new sources of energy. So I just wanted to put this up there to give the national context around the complexity and the scale of this transition that literally has to happen in the next 25 years. It is an enormous undertaking, and it is an enormously complex undertaking intellectually, in terms of markets, but also in terms of investment. So that's the big picture of what we have to do in order to get to net 50 by 2050. So, what do we, as the good citizens of the good people of Burwood and Strathfield, what part do we have to play in this whole picture as we are confronting rising power prices, sort of ourselves? what role do we have to play in all of this? The third little bit of context. Why is that not showing? There we go. For those of you, most of you may know this, but I just thought it'd be useful as we come to Nicola's presentation to just give everybody an overview of the different players within the energy supply chain at the moment. And there's a reason for me doing this. Up here, of course, we have the generators. So they're the people who produce the power, whether it's coal-fired power plants or whether they're, solar farms or rooftop solar or whatever. That power then goes into transmission networks. These are the high voltage networks. In New South Wales, it's essentially, the company is called Transgrid. Right? So they run the high voltage power lines, and because it's high voltage, they're the long distance power lines. Think of them as the big national highways or freeways, for cars, but they're like kind of freeways for electricity. Right? And then what happens is it goes into substations, and then the high voltage is converted to low voltage, because if you connect up your home to the high voltage thing, it'd blow everything up. So it's got to be converted to 240 volts, so it's got to be converted to lower voltage. So that is done, it goes through a series of substations and transformers, and then there are another group of players, the distributors, who basically own all the poles and wires to bring the power from the substations to your homes. So the street, power poles and all of the wires and all of that is done by the distributors. And the main distributor here in New South Wales is Ausgrid. Out west, there's Endeavour Energy, and there's also Essential Energy that does the sort of regional New South Wales. So these guys are the distributors, and you can think of the distributors as sort of like the bigger roads, the Hume Highway, or Parramatta Road, the bigger state roads, are kind of a way to think about the distributors. Then you've got the retailers. Now they're the people that, as consumers, we would know the best. They're the people who interface with us. So Origin Energy, Energy Australia, AGL. And interestingly, you can see here that in New South Wales, some 80% of the market is controlled by these top three big energy retailers. Origin's the biggest, there's Energy Australia, and then there's AGL. Can I just ask, how many of you here are not with one of these top three? Okay, you guys are clearly the early adopters in this. But most people, I'll take a question in a second. Most people in New South Wales, for some reason, it's not like this in other states, get their power from these three big companies. And they're the ones, so what do the retailers do? They do, yeah, you know where I'm going with this. They do the marketing, they do the billing, and they do price hedging. And by price hedging, it means that they will buy wholesale power from the national energy market, and that the wholesale power prices fluctuate. I think the price changes every 5 minutes or so, and it goes up and down. But they have a contracted price with you. Generally speaking, there's a contracted price with you. So what they have to do is make sure that if the wholesale price surges, they don't go bankrupt because they've contracted with their customers at a lower price. So they have a bunch of complex financial instruments in order to hedge their pricing. But that is essentially what the retailers do. They own none of the infrastructure. They do none of the generation, right? They do none of the technical work. But they market, they bill, and they do the price hedging so that they don't go bankrupt. That's what the retailers do. And for that, they earn, I don't know what the retail profit margins of the retailers in New South Wales, but it would be between 10 to 20%, somewhere around that. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this, right? And this is the context at which, this is the place where I'm going to hand over.
Sorry, before you leave that chart, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I can't read all the detail there, but I think you've left 2 items off. Above the generators, you need to put the New South Wales government. Firstly, all the coal, all the gas, some of the water, most of the water is actually owned by the New South Wales government and then sells it at trivial prices, in my view. The other one you miss is when you get to transmission, distribution, energy retails, off to the side, but certainly with a line across, you need to put the New South Wales government again, because the regulation of the transmission, distribution and energy retail is the responsibility for the New South Wales government takes control of that.
Yeah, fair enough.
So-
okay, yeah, no, fair enough. That's a fair enough point. Around all of this is, of course, the regulatory framework.
And it's quite a tight regulatory framework.
Yeah, it is.
But going back to the issue about the assets, New South Wales has, Newcastle is the biggest export coal port in the world.
Yep.
And the amount of capital or amount of contribution to the New South Wales government, the people in New South Wales from selling coal
Yep.
over the last 80 years
Yep.
has been trivial.
Yep. Okay. Let's come back to that later. I just don't want to get distracted at the moment and stay focused on before we hand over to Nicholas. That context is